According to our records, you don't exist, the passport office clerk said, her voice flat with bureaucratic confusion as she stared at her computer screen. There's a birth certificate for Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore born on your date, at your hospital, to your parents, but Meredith Jane Whitmore, the name you've used your entire life, shows a death certificate filed 2 weeks after birth. I stood frozen at the counter, my driver's license and social security card suddenly feeling like props in a play I didn't know I was performing. But why had I lived 28 years believing I was Meredith, and why did every government database insist that Meredith was the twin who had died? That's impossible. I'm Meredith. I've always been Meredith. Ma'am, I'm showing you the records. She turned her monitor slightly. Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore, born March 15, 1996. Living. Meredith Jane Whitmore, born March 15, 1996. Deceased, March 29, 1996. But I'm alive. I'm standing right here. Then either you're Margaret using the wrong name, or there's been a significant error in vital records. She paused. Or something else entirely. The something else entirely would take 6 months to unravel. And it would destroy everything I thought I knew about my family. I'd known about my twin since childhood. Margaret, Maggie, my parents called her, had died of SIDS 2 weeks after we were born. A tragedy that shaped our family, that explained the sadness in my mother's eyes when she looked at baby photographs, that justified my father's occasional distance when I reached milestones Maggie would never share. I'd grown up as the surviving twin. The lucky one. The child who carried the weight of being enough for two. I'd visited Maggie's grave every year on our birthday, leaving flowers for the sister I'd never known, feeling the particular grief of surviving when someone identical to you didn't. For 28 years, that was the story. The truth, I'd believed. The passport application revealed it was a carefully constructed lie. The investigation began with vital records. I hired an attorney who specialized in identity cases, a woman named Sandra who'd seen enough bureaucratic nightmares to know this wasn't a simple clerical error. The records are clear and consistent, she told me after 2 weeks of research. Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore is the identity attached to your social security number, your school records, your medical history. Meredith Jane Whitmore has a death certificate filed by your parents when you were 2 weeks old. But they called me Meredith my whole life. They called you Meredith. But legally, you've always been Margaret. Sandra spread documents across her desk. Here's what I think happened, your twin died, and instead of reporting her death as Margaret, they reported it as Meredith. Then they raised you using Meredith's name while keeping Margaret's identity for official purposes. Why would anyone do that? That's the question, isn't it? The simple answer is usually money. The complicated answer is usually worse. The money trail revealed the simple answer first. Margaret had been designated as beneficiary of a trust fund established by my maternal grandmother, a woman who died before I was born but had left specific provisions for her first grandchild. The trust was worth $340,000 at the time of our birth. By the time I discovered the identity swap, it had grown to $1.2 million. Meredith, born 4 minutes after Margaret, was not included in the trust. First grandchild meant exactly that, first. Second twins didn't qualify. When Margaret died, the trust provisions should have been voided. The money would have returned to the estate and been distributed according to other terms. Unless Margaret didn't die. Unless Meredith died instead, and Margaret lived on, raised under her dead twin's name, but maintaining her legal identity for financial purposes. My parents had swapped our deaths to keep the money. The implications cascaded through 28 years of memories. Every time they'd called me Meredith, they'd known it was a lie. Every visit to Margaret's grave, they'd known their living daughter was mourning under false pretenses. Every milestone, every birthday, every moment of my life, they'd maintained a deception that erased my real sister and stole my real identity. I wasn't Meredith. I'd never been Meredith. I was Margaret, raised to believe I was someone else so my parents could access a trust fund they weren't entitled to. My twin, the real Meredith, lay in that grave I'd visited every year, buried under the wrong name, mourned under the wrong identity. The confrontation happened at my parents' house. I brought Sandra, my attorney. I brought documentation. I brought 28 years of questions that finally had answers I didn't want. I know what you did. My mother's face went pale. My father's jaw tightened. Maggie didn't die. I'm Maggie. Meredith died, and you buried her under my name so you could keep grandmother's trust fund. Meredith, that's not. My name is Margaret. You've been calling me the wrong name for 28 years because admitting I'm Margaret would have required you to acknowledge the fraud. The silence in the room was suffocating. We can explain, my father finally said. Then explain. Explain how you looked at your 2-week-old daughter's body and decided to bury her under the wrong name. Explain how you raised me for 28 years knowing I was living someone else's identity. Explain how you visited a grave every year knowing the wrong child was buried there. Their explanation was worse than I'd imagined. We didn't plan it, my mother said, her voice shaking. When Meredith died, we were devastated. Destroyed. And then we realized what her death meant for the trust fund. We'd lose everything your grandmother had left for Margaret, so you decided to swap the death certificates. We decided to protect our surviving daughter's inheritance. My father's tone was defensive. Margaret was entitled to that money. Meredith wasn't. If we'd reported the truth, you would have grown up without the resources your grandmother intended for you. Resources you controlled. Resources you spent. Resources I never saw. The trust fund had been managed by my parents as custodians until I turned 25. I'd never received notifications about it because all correspondence went to their address. They'd told me my grandmother had left me nothing. In reality, they'd spent most of the $1.2 million on themselves, home renovations, cars, vacations, lifestyle inflation that they'd never explained and I'd never questioned. The fraud was comprehensive. The money was only part of it. The identity swap had required ongoing maintenance, careful lies, coordinated stories, deliberate misdirection whenever questions arose. They'd homeschooled me until 3rd grade, avoiding early bureaucratic complications. They'd moved twice during my childhood, leaving behind anyone who might have known both twins. They'd created a narrative so complete that even I had believed it entirely. The grave marker for Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore was actually my sister Meredith. The child I'd mourned my entire life was me, or who I was supposed to be. They'd stolen my name, my identity, my inheritance, and my ability to properly grieve my own sister. The legal proceedings were complex. Identity fraud. Trust fund misappropriation. Filing false death certificates. The charges accumulated as investigators uncovered the full scope of what my parents had done. The death certificate fraud is the most serious, Sandra explained. They filed a false report with the county, claiming a different child died than actually died. That's a felony. The trust fund issues are civil matters, but combined with the identity fraud. How much trouble are they in? Your father is facing potential prison time. Your mother might receive a lighter sentence if she cooperates, but she's still culpable. Sandra paused. The question is whether you want to pursue this fully. What do you mean? You could report everything and let the system handle it. Or you could negotiate, get the remaining trust funds, get an official correction of the records, and avoid a public trial that would destroy your family. My family destroyed itself 28 years ago. I just didn't know it yet. The investigation uncovered more than fraud. Buried in medical records and old correspondence, investigators found documentation that changed everything again. Letters between my parents and their pediatrician, written in the weeks after the death. References to complications and difficult decisions. A phrase that stopped me cold. Given the medical situation, we had to consider which child had better prospects. The pediatrician's notes were more clinical. Parents informed that Margaret's prognosis was uncertain due to cardiac defect detected during postnatal screening. Meredith showed no such complications. Discussed options for care. Margaret, me, had been born with a heart defect. Meredith had been healthy. When Meredith died of SIDS, my parents had faced a choice: report the healthy twin's death and keep the sick twin's identity, potentially losing both the trust fund and their remaining child to medical complications. Or swap the identities, keeping the trust fund active and raising Margaret under Meredith's name. They'd chosen based on money and odds. They'd gambled that I would survive despite my heart condition, and they'd covered their bet by keeping Margaret's legal identity attached to the trust fund. The heart defect explained things I'd never understood. The surgeries I'd had as a child, explained as routine procedures. The medications I'd taken for years, described as preventive care. The cardiologist appointments that had continued into adulthood, always handled by my parents until I'd aged out of their insurance. I'd been told I had a minor condition that was easily managed. I'd been told it was nothing to worry about. In reality, I'd had a congenital heart defect that required significant intervention. My parents had navigated my medical care while simultaneously maintaining the fiction that I was the healthy twin who'd survived. The irony was grotesque. They'd chosen to raise the sick child under the healthy child's name, gambling on my survival while protecting their financial interests. The psychological impact was devastating. I'd spent 28 years believing I was Meredith. Building an identity around that name. Developing a sense of self based on being the surviving twin, the second-born, the one who carried her sister's memory. None of it was real. I wasn't Meredith. I'd never been Meredith. The personality I'd constructed, the self-image I'd developed, the relationship I'd had with my own history, all of it was built on a foundation of lies. The grief I'd felt for Margaret was grief for myself, for the identity I'd never been allowed to have. The connection I felt to my dead twin was a connection to a fiction my parents had created. Therapy became essential. The identity reconstruction was overwhelming. "You're still you," my therapist said during one session. "Your name might have been wrong, but your experiences, your memories, your personality, those are real. Those are yours. But I built them believing I was someone else." "You built them as yourself. The name is a label. What matters is the person you've become." It helped. Slowly. The criminal proceedings moved forward. My father received 4 years in federal prison for fraud and filing false vital records. My mother received 2 years, reduced due to her cooperation and evidence of my father's primary role in orchestrating the deception. The trust fund, what remained of it, was transferred to my control. $287,000, after decades of their spending and recent legal fees. A fraction of what should have been there. But the money had never really been the point. The vital records were corrected. After months of legal proceedings, the county agreed to amend the death certificate and birth records. Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore was officially recognized as living. Meredith Jane Whitmore was officially acknowledged as the twin who had died. The grave marker was changed. Meredith finally rested under her own name. I stood at the cemetery for 2 hours the day the new marker was installed. 28 years of visiting my own grave, mourning myself under false pretenses. Now I could finally mourn my sister properly. "I'm sorry I didn't know you," I said to the stone. "I'm sorry they took your name and gave you mine. I'm sorry I spent my whole life believing I was you." The wind offered no response. But something shifted inside me, a grief I'd been carrying wrong finally finding its proper shape. Rebuilding my identity took years. Legally, I had to decide, continue using Meredith, the name I'd known my entire life, or reclaim Margaret, the name that was legally and biologically mine. I chose Margaret. Not to erase Meredith. I'd already spent too many years doing that unknowingly. But to finally be who I actually was. To honor the identity my parents had stolen by reclaiming it consciously. The transition was awkward. Friends who'd known me as Meredith struggled with the change. Professional contacts were confused. The explanations were exhausting. But each time I signed Margaret, I felt something settle. Something true. My parents were released after serving their sentences. I didn't attend the release hearings. I didn't visit them in prison. When my mother reached out afterward, seeking reconciliation, I sent a brief response through my attorney. "You raised me under a dead child's name to steal money that was legally mine. You buried my sister under my name. You lied to me every day for 28 years. I don't know what reconciliation would look like after that. I don't know if I want to find out." My mother wrote back, eventually. A long letter explaining their desperation, their fear, their conviction that they were doing what was best for their surviving daughter. "We always loved you, Margaret. Everything we did was because we loved you and wanted to protect your future." I read the letter 3 times. They'd loved me. That might even be true. But they'd loved me while lying about who I was. They protected my future by destroying my past. They built my life on a foundation of fraud and expected me to be grateful for the structure. Love that requires deception isn't love. It's control with better marketing. I met someone who understood. Her name was Diana. She worked in genealogical research and had seen plenty of family secrets uncovered through DNA testing and record searches. "People do terrible things to protect what they think matters," she told me during one of our early conversations. "The tragedy is that they usually protect the wrong things. Your parents protected money. They should have protected truth. They thought they were protecting me. They thought they were protecting themselves. The money, the lifestyle, the avoidance of difficult explanations. If they'd told the truth when Meredith died, they would have lost the trust fund, but they would have had an honest family. Instead, they kept the money and built a family on lies. Was it worth it? You're asking me, or you're asking them? Maybe both. From where I sit, it clearly wasn't. They got money they had to hide, a life they couldn't explain, and a daughter they lost anyway when the truth emerged." Diana reached across the table and took my hand. "The real question is whether it was worth it for you. Whether surviving as Margaret under Meredith's name gave you something you wouldn't have had otherwise." I thought about it for a long time. I survived. I built a life. I became someone I'm mostly proud of. I paused. But I became that person without knowing who I actually was. Every achievement, every relationship, every moment of growth, it happened while I was carrying a lie I didn't know about. And now? Now I know the truth. Now I can rebuild on something real. The grave marker reads correctly now. Meredith Jane Whitmore. March 15, 1996 to March 29, 1996. Beloved daughter and sister. I visit on our birthday every year. But now I'm visiting my sister, not my fictional self. Now I can mourn properly, the twin I never knew, stolen from me twice, once by death, once by parents who gave her my name. I leave 2 sets of flowers. One for Meredith. One for the 28 years of Margaret that were buried with her. Both losses deserve recognition. I legally changed my name to Margaret Meredith Whitmore. A combination. A recognition. My true identity, carrying my sister's name within it rather than instead of it. I exist now. Fully, officially, correctly. When I applied for a passport again, this time with accurate documents, the process was smooth. No complications. No existential confusion. Everything looks in order, Ms. Whitmore, the clerk said. It does now. It took a while to get there. She stamped the application without curiosity. For her, it was routine paperwork. For me, it was the final document in a journey that had dismantled and rebuilt my entire understanding of who I was. They told me I was Meredith my whole life. They buried Margaret, supposedly, and raised Meredith to carry her sister's memory. But Meredith died at 2 weeks old. I was Margaret, living under the wrong name so my parents could steal trust fund money that was legally mine. For 28 years, I visited my own grave, mourned my own death, believed I was someone I wasn't. The passport application revealed the truth. The investigation revealed the money. The records revealed the choice the ED made when faced with one dead child and one sick one: swap the identities, keep the inheritance, and gamble that Margaret would survive under Meredith's name. I survived. I discovered. I reclaimed. My name is Margaret Meredith Whitmore, both twins, recognized at last. One living, one remembered. Both finally real.